Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is a presentation by Dr. Margaret Moss, and she is the Winograd professorship that she has, and we've been very fortunate that we were able to snap her up. The first thing I want to do, though, is I want to take this opportunity to thank our donor, and that is Professor Peter Winograd. He's a faculty emeritus from the law school. And because of him, we're able to have a Winograd visiting professorship in nursing. And so she is our very first one. And I can't think of anybody better that we could have had to have this wonderful professorship. So I'm going to introduce you to her. She is Dr. Margaret P. Moss. She is an enrolled member of the Mandan Nation and has equal lineage in a Canadian Dakota nation, Saskatchewan. Is that correct? Okay. She's been a nurse for 31 years, and she's a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing. Dr. Moss is the first American Indian to hold both a nursing and Juris doctorates. She's been in academia for 20 years and is currently at the University of Minnesota as Associate Dean for Nursing and Health Policy and in the Faculty of Applied Science as a professor in the School of Nursing. In 2014, she was a Fulbright visiting research chair in Aboriginal Indigenous life and culture in the North American context at McGill University in Montreal. She's been a Robert Wood Johnson Fellow Health Policy. She staffed the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging and enacted the National Alzheimer's Project Act when she was working there. She's published her nursing textbook on American Indian health, which won an AJN Book of the Year in 2 categories. And then you also did the health equity and nursing, which was out in 2020. She's given in numerous presentations at local, national, and international. And then I just wanted to add a little bit of something that I have gotten to know her over this year. And I first met her at a conference and I was so amazed by her. And I really, really worked to get her to come here. And here's the history of her in New Mexico. She actually had 2 of her children here, 3 of her children were born here. And we have 1. Thank you, Marika, for coming. And also she worked at the IHS and the VA. She also did her doctoral dissertation with the Zuni elders, and it was an ethnology on aging. So she has, I think she has a close connection with New Mexico. And we went today up to the nursing at the nursing program that's at up on the hill. Rio Rancho, thank you. It's, been a long day. Rio Rancho, and she used to live there. So it was quite something for her to see the change, how much larger it is. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to her, and you all are in for a real treat.
Technology. Okay, well, thank you for having me here. Can you hear where it is? Okay, good. I really appreciate this third opportunity to be here. And I wanted to reintroduce myself. So Doja, How, Petu Washte, Margaret Moss, Ka, Medicine Robe, Imakiapie, Damakote, Papekute, Oyate, Himatanhanye, Hidaja, Ed Omawapie. So I just told you my Christian name, Margaret Moss, but my traditional name is Medicine Robe. And I am Dakota, which is what I was speaking in because it's wider known language. Hidatsa is where I am enrolled. It's the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation in North Dakota. But that's an isolate. Anyway, you don't need to know all that. So anyway, thank you for having me. Figure out the technology here in a minute. I can just do the aerial, right? Oh, I didn't see it. Okay. So we'll just go ahead and start. And having spent 5 to 6 years in Canada, they're really into the land acknowledgement, which they should be. But I always try to add a little something. So I try to say that, first of all, there's 2 parts to a land acknowledgement for real. First, acknowledge the land, which means go outside, see the land, offer one of the 4 medicines or whatever's tribally appropriate, and thank the land for everything and rivers, the trees, etc. That's the land acknowledgement. Then you come inside and thank the people that had been stewards all along and are not relegated to just history, but there's people alive right now, who are still stewarding the land, whether that was their original land or if they're doing it now or all of the above. Here, Sandia people recognizing there's other pueblos, Navajo, Apache, crisscrossing historically the land and so forth. So we try to take some tobacco and put it out wherever I'm traveling to the actual land. So today we're going to talk a little bit about nursing and vis-a-vis American Indian nursing and so forth. And there's some experts in here. And to understand what impacts the future of nursing for American Indian nursing. And I put one chapter like that in my textbook. It's getting old now, from 9 years. But I was responding to the future of nursing. The first report, is everybody familiar with that report? And it's the most downloaded, formerly Institute of Medicine report, and they put out tons of reports. Now it's called National Academy of Medicine. And not to stray, but I don't think I have a slide for this. When I looked at that first one, I think American Indians were mentioned 1, 2, or 3 times. One was only to say 0.3% of nurses are American Indians, and then there were like 1 or 2 quick mentions, and that was it. So in my textbook, I expanded a little bit more about that. Second one, 2030, is responding a little bit better, but it took 10 years. And then talk about decolonization, indigenization, and reconciliation. Are people familiar with those terms? So I have an example of that towards the very end. So this talk is going to be in 3 pieces. First, a little bit about nursing and just some facts, because this is going to go pretty fast. I could literally talk for 4 hours. So I have 45 minutes. So it's going to go fast. And then the second one is my story, to let people know that you've heard one Indian story, you've heard one Indian story. And I will say Indian because I'm old. And people in my age group all say Indian. Native American was sort of a feel-good term from the 60s or whatever. The actual legal term is Indian in both countries, Canada and US. And to make it a little more specific, we say American Indian and / Alaska Native, because they have the same sort of historical roots and so forth. So anyway, so it's going to be a few facts, then my story, and then how that feeds into decolonization and so forth. This is a picture of the First Nations Longhouse, which I ran for 5 years at the University of British Columbia. It's a huge university of about 70,000. There are about 2,000 Indigenous students there. This is a really large facility with the only academic library run on the Indigenous cataloging system based on Brian Deere, not the Library of Congress. And then they had another whole facility just for residential survivors and history and so forth. So there was a lot going on at that one campus. Lots of totem poles, and I'll show you the reconciliation pole at the very end. And of course, are we all familiar with the Red Dress Project for representing missing and murdered Indigenous at that time? Women and girls. Now we include relatives broadly. So just trying to put some of these things up. Anyway, as I was looking at some facts, first just about nurses in the US, as we all probably know in this room, it's the largest healthcare profession, and there's about 4.3 actively licensed registered nurses. That's from the Bureau of Healthcare Workers. And there are about 11,000 American Indian Alaska Native nurses. That's 0.26%. That's horrifying. 0.2%. We'd have to quadruple it just to get the 1%. And so we have to wonder why is that the case? And I have some answers, but we'll move along for a minute. And in New Mexico, there are 15,000-ish, almost 16,000 registered nurses. Does that sound right? And then 11% of New Mexico is people of Native American ancestry, and 4% of nurses are tribally affiliated. I hope that sounds right too. I was just looking this stuff up. So that's good and bad. And why I say that, it's good, it's great, it's much better than 0.26%. But what do we have in place? Knowing you have this much larger percentage, have faculty, have educational facilities, have hospitals ramped up their understanding? Have they gotten indigenous leaders, teachers, other nurses in the hospital systems and so forth, community health? And if they have, are they giving development in education, faculty development in the hospital systems? Are they having, mandatory learnings about at least the tribes in the area? From talking around the last year or so, my understanding is probably no. There might be a few things, but you go 2, 3 questions deep, nobody knows anything. So that's got to change, absolutely. So I ask a lot of my talk people, although I think a bunch of them are on Zoom, so they can't answer, they luck out. And no natives can answer this. How many federally recognized tribes are there in the US? Who knows? 576, but you're close. I think Virginia added a couple. So, but you're close, you win, although you weren't supposed to answer. So I talk all over the country, coast to coast, north to south. And for 35 years, I've been a nurse, 24 years in academia. Nobody, and I usually say natives can't answer. They never know. So if we don't know the simplest statistics, how are we all saying we give culturally respectful care and culturally sensitive care and all that? We don't even know who's in the bed in front of us. And then that's the other thing is identity. Do we know what an Indian looks like? And often I'll put up my children's picture. All 4 of them are enrolled members of the 3 affiliated tribes in North Dakota. But my husband's Black. They run the gamut from looking Black to Middle Eastern. And I always tell the story of my one son. Well, my husband was a basketball player. Gonzaga, anybody? He was the center at Gonzaga. So we lived at Portland before we moved here. And of course, Hakeem Olajuwon was his big. So my first son's named Hakeem. I'm like, you get one. That's it. And so Hakeem, when we moved to DC for my fellowship, he, had his little sign, Hakeem. He was working at the grocery store. He's 18. And Middle Eastern men would come up to him and go, Hakeem, my friend, where are you from? And he's like, Bethesda, I don't, so if Middle Eastern men think he's Middle Eastern, nobody's going to peg him for an American Indian, but he is. And another daughter who looks probably more on the Black on the spectrum. But that's one of the lessons I give all nurses everywhere I talk. You need to ask people how they want to identify. They will do one of several things: tell you to go pound sand, none of your dang business, or they'll tell you the bare minimums, or you'll learn more than you ever. I'm a two-spirited, Omaha from, the reservation or something. Now that gave you a lot of information. But if you don't understand what that means to be from the reservation, you don't know they're qualified for Indian Health Services. If they're in North Carolina and they give you some kind of tribe, I think 7 of the 8 are state recognized tribes. There's about 66 of those nationwide. Then you know that you have to route them to the state programs. If they're unaffiliated, then you need to look for nonprofits and things. But if you don't even know the differences between identity and status, then you don't know how to take care of that person. And we all say, oh, we're culturally competent and safe and respectful and human. You don't even, you've probably had, not just you, the royal you, nurses have had American Indian patients and don't know it because you can't always see it. They don't always say it, especially older ones, if they were caught up in the assimilation era and termination and all that. So nurses, data is terrible for American Indians. It's really off. So nurses with 4 million people, if they even just start asking every person in their charge, how would you like to identify? data will go up because it's miserable right now. There's a thing called Trends in Indian Health, hasn't been published since 2014, and that's the major report out of Indian Health Service. And right now, if you look at it electronically, you can do the find feature on asterisks, and it's in there like 130 times saying, but we don't really know, but we don't really have good state info. But you know, so all of it's guessing. As bad as it is, it's much worse because we're misidentified 40% of the time, according to some studies. So anyway, that's the importance of that. So I'm saying it's good that there's 4% native nurses in this state, but what are we doing about that? Are they just out floundering and, you know, every man for himself? So there really needs to be some good programming. And the disconnect I have here in that picture is because there have been studies about concordance of provider and patient. And a lot of them are inconclusive. But if you go in and look, none of them include American Indians. It's all black and white and this sort of thing. So you can't draw these same conclusions. And only American Indians really understand, I can't say only, largely understand the history, the geography, the politics of their area and what's important into their health. Other people don't really know. So that would be one recommendation is get faculty development. Everybody ask, how would you like to identify? But then if you do ask and they say, oh, by the way, I'm this tribe, you have to know what that means. So at least get to know the tribe in your region, if nothing else. And so I often say in my talks, it's by design, people don't know any of this. And it was federal policy periods that made it so we don't know this. So I'm not going to go through them today. That was the first talk I did. But literally the tagline from the federal government was get rid of the Indian problem. And that's how we got reservations, relocations, assimilation, termination, and so forth. And they did a really good job because what do you learn? What did you learn? K through 12, college, unless you sought out electives, nobody's just handing you this information. And so nobody knows it, including health professionals. And so then they don't get the whole, you know, historical trauma. And it's why can't they get over it? That was 300 years ago and all that sort of thing. Because it was on purpose that you don't know it. But then I always say, now that you hear this, you have to go seek it out. So you need to know the distinguishing histories and how this lack of understanding hits elders, infants, mothers, urban, rural. There's huge differences. Everybody can't be put in the same bucket. And then when we always, elders was my original entree into all this research and so forth. And, you know, you talk to some Indian elders, especially if they're traditional, and many are. And, you know, nurses and others will say, oh, they're really slow to, they're not listening. They won't say anything and whatever. Well, because they're reeling through, you know, when oral cultures, you are reeling through. What can you say? What can't you say? You can say things in this season or at night or not to that person. There's all these rules. You think APA is bad. You know, oral literacy is like this. So it takes a long time because many truly believe that you can speak bad into being. So they really have to think, even though we have the sayings, even in the West, about, you know, think before you speak. Nobody does. So, but they have to do it. So with that in mind, when a native comes in who is reticent, who's distrustful, whether they're elder or not, and people say, how are you? You have to think, oh, do I have to go through Indians 101 with this person, get them up to the point where I can tell them what's wrong? Or do you just say nothing, or I have a cold? You know, but you need to know as a healthcare provider what could be the possible things up to this point. And it gets very tiresome to have to tell people all of this Indians 101 so you can get to your problem. I have that same problem as an academic on panels. Let's say it's on aging or health policy or some of my areas. They're like, okay, you got 20 minutes with the other people. I'm like, it's going to take me 18 to get them up to snuff. And then I have like 2 minutes to tell them whatever the phenomena is. And so these are all disparities. People have to recognize that. And I say take a page from Canada because as I go around talking to all the nursing schools around the country, you know, everybody goes, well, that would be nice to add some of this information, but we don't have one more credit. We don't have, you can't, the nursing program's packed. But guess what? In Canada, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of 2015, they mandated Indigenous education, health, promotion, engagement to all health professional schools. So guess what? When I was up there, I taught one of these mandatory classes. It can be done, you know, and we had elders and knowledge keepers come in every single class, and we taught it in the Longhouse, and we had the very last class, medicine making, and we had like beer grease going on the stove, and you know, teas and all this stuff, so people could really get in there and see what we're talking about. And unless you have that faculty development or bring in faculty who are native to the area and so forth, or somebody who really knows who isn't native, they'd have to have a deep understanding though. Until you get that, you get faculty who are just reading the book two chapters ahead of these people and saying, oh, Indians really like this, or don't do that, or what. You know, they can tell if it's life experience or not. So those things have to happen. So I always talk about this. Did you know that there are approximately 60 million, and some estimates are higher, but I took a middle one, like 40 to 80 million Indigenous people across what is now Canada and US prior to contact. And then did you know in 1900, if you can look, the green ones are Indigenous people. They were running the roost. Then you see that little teeny flat line there. That's American Indians in the US in 1900. It was less than 200,000. 200,000. That's stunning from millions. So I always say if we were wolves, we'd be endangered, we'd be protected. But since we're Indians, nobody cares. Nobody cares. It was almost completely, massively, that was it. We were almost extinct. And we fought our way back up. I think in the year I was born, don't look it up, there were about 500,000 in the US. And now we're up to 3-ish to 9-ish, depending on how you count. I think there's maybe some IHS people know here, like roughly 3 million who are able to be enrolled in IHS services or something. And then not the 9 million comes from census and other things, but those things are self-report. So sometimes you get the, I think my grandmother was, and you check it, you know. So it's somewhere in there lies how many there are, but it's taken all this time to fight our way back up to at least a few million. The other, the blue, is pre-contact. There wasn't anybody here. And now we're up to 350 million non-native, non-indigenous people in the US. So it just, you know, well, I won't get political. Anyway, it looks like one was replaced with the other. But anyway, so people don't really realize how desperate it was, and that it's lucky that a few of us are here to start it over again. So in my first talk, I went deeply through all the federal policy periods. I won't do that again. I'm picking out the yellow one, which is assimilation mainly is what I'm going to talk about versus allotment. Are people familiar with allotment and assimilation period? And I do that because it's my story. So I was asked to also tell some about my story. Has anybody heard this tagline, kill the Indian, save the child? Another federal policy period. Kill the Indian, save the child. And there's also kill the Indian, save the man. So I'm going to read this, even though it's there. It is a great mistake to think that the Indian is born an inevitable savage. He is born a blank, like all the rest of us. Left in the surroundings of savagery, he grows to possess a savage language, superstition, and life. Transfer the savage-born infant to the surroundings of civilization, and he will grow to possess a civilized language and habit. These results have been established over and over and beyond all question. So this is from, pictured here, Captain R.H. Pratt. This is from 1892 in a report called The Advantages of Mingling Indians with Whites. And he coined the phrase, kill the Indian, save the child. And he is the founder of the first and most notorious boarding school the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Are people familiar with the Carlisle School? Just horrendous. And there's one of the famous pictures of it. And the children were, in many cases, put in trains, like from Montana, North Dakota, whatever, and sent east. Did you know that? And they could be as young as 3, 4, and 5. They never, in many cases, saw their people again. They never saw their parents again. The parents never saw them again. It's just a horrendous part of history. And did you know that Hitler got his ideas of moving the Jewish people from how the US treated American Indians? The train thing, the ghettos versus reservations, et cetera, just horrendous. And historical trauma was first noted, the idea of it, with the Jews out of, Europe and so forth. And then it was also applied to American Indians, even though that's where it started from. That's where he got the ideas from. Just horrendous. And yet you really don't hear any moral outcry on American Indians. You do about Jewish people. I mean, of course, they have their problems, people like them, people don't like them, but most people will recognize that what happened was horrendous. But nobody's recognizing this. They're like, yeah, they went to school. And I don't know if you noticed, maybe 2 years ago, in Canada, they now have this device that can see under the ground, some deep sensing something or other. And they found so many mass graves around these schools. And then they started looking in the US, and same thing. And one thing we saw that was in papers and TV, et cetera, was that they put up some, what do you call it, blueprints of the schools when they were getting ready to build them. And on the blueprint, it said graveyard. I mean, how many of us send our kids to schools with graveyards just ready and waiting? And yet, again, nobody knows this. Nobody pays attention. These are the roots of historical trauma. Well, there's more beyond that, but this is a big one. There was a study in Canada that children of, they call them residential school survivors, commit suicide. You're not supposed to say anymore. What should I say? There's a PC way of saying it, sorry. Or something. Anyway, sorry. Anyway, you don't want to blame the victim. But they experience suicide completion at greater rates than any students or school or children who aren't the daughters and sons of survivors, even though they never went. That's another explanation for historical trauma. They never went, but they end up killing themselves more than other people. And again, is this on CNN or MSNBC? Where's the moral outrage, really, from any of this? So anyway, but there were 2 prongs of assimilation: the boarding schools, and then adopting out and fostering out Indian kids into good white families. Are people aware of that? It was literally a policy. And that's to kill the Indian, save the child. Either boarding schools or get them into white families so they can become, part of the body politic and be good citizens. So these are pictures from my own family. So is it the same that way? Front row, third from the right is my mother. She's in an Indian day school on the reservation. The next picture, the woman sitting and to the left with her husband behind her is my great-great-grandmother coming from the Dakotas in Saskatchewan, the Dakota tribe up there. And then on the bottom, on the far right guy, is my great-grandfather from North Dakota. So I like to put these up as a reminder of people who were just living their lives. This is what they looked like. This is what they were doing. It wasn't a powwow. It wasn't dress up. This is them. And so I also like this one. So the little boy is my grandfather. And that's my great-grandfather again from the other picture. And they're in the Antelope Society. You can see the hooves and whatnot. So it just took 2 generations to get from that grandfather, the little boy, to me over here in my first communion with my white father. That's a lot of intervention. That's a lot of, boy, that is a lot of, I can't even think of the word, interference, whatever you want to call it. Oh, that was loud. Anyway, to get from here to here, 2 generations. That's not long, you know, because people think the picture on the left was the olden days or whatever. I believe that picture is from about 1906. You know, so it wasn't that long, but that's how those policy periods just beat and beat and beat and beat. So of course, here I am, my hair's cut, I speak English, went to Catholic school, all the same things that happened in the boarding schools here, although they treated me well, but they treated me how you would treat a nice little white girl, which I wasn't, and the rest of the world didn't buy it. You know, they didn't buy, oh, you're a good white girl, we won't pick on you. So it was a huge failed operation. And so in 1978, I believe it was, ICWA came in. Does anybody know ICWA? The Indian Child Welfare Act, which made it against the law to do this anymore. So the way I grew up, and there were 2 other, they were a brother and sister, biological, we're all from the same tribe, but I wasn't biologically related to them. We were all 3 adopted, and this is before the Indian Child Welfare Act of '78. So the way the 3 of us grew up is against federal law today. And I'm shocked that this came up for review a couple of years ago and it passed through. So they kept it because it was a huge failure. So many people failure to thrive again in so many ways. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. This is me 100 years ago. So I just graduated biology in Washington State, where my parents who raised me lived. And I didn't want them to feel bad. So I waited until I was through college. Literally the next day, I got in my little stripped down car. There's no cell phones. There's no GPS. I barely had a map, and I'm batting across from, you know, Spokane, Washington to the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. I didn't know anything about it. But I went to meet my mother because I knew she had reached out. And this is my brother, who was the tribal police chief on the Sisseton Reservation. That's where we are right there, which wasn't far from where she was. So we went to visit. So this is when I'm going to transition, and I have to read some of this because this had been done as a TED Talk a couple years ago, and I long ago didn't memorize it anymore. So we'll see how this goes. So again, my remarks will have 2 parts, a background on one Indian experience and perspectives, followed by one path to reconciliation. I'll take you back to when I was 15 years old and living in Portland, Oregon. Again, Hakeem Olajuwon. I've moved a lot. I was a VA brat, but at this point I was out there and I would go on adventures with my father. We were a family of 7, 5 kids, but I'm the only one who ever went on these adventures. So this time we were going to go find a logging road in the Cascade Mountains, and just to see what it was like. I foolishly went along with this, but we didn't have an ATV, mind you. It was 1973. And this is what my father thought would be a good idea, to go on a logging road in a 1971 Mercury Marquis, which was as big as a boat and low to the ground. And I thought, is this a good idea? What could go wrong? I don't know. So my father was a surgeon, trained in neurosurgery, and was pretty high up in the VA, yet this is what he thought was a good idea. So off we went on this folly. One side, almost like this picture, went straight up, and the other one went straight down. And halfway, I was no longer interested, and I said, let me out. And he did. So I'm walking behind this stupid car up this logging road, and I would think to myself, how did I get here, and what am I doing, and who is this man? And so now I bring you back literally to how did I get there? My story is a story of belonging, and I'm going to bring it to how we bring that understanding to students and student nurses, health professionals like me, and I'm going to share my lived experience in the next few minutes. I'm an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes of North Dakota. Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikari, I'm mainly Hidatsa, some Mandan from there. This is a photo I took on my reservation in Fort Berthold, North Dakota. This is where I'm from. This is where my roots and several generations of my family are from. I'm a survivor of the federal Indian assimilation laws. Most people don't have the slightest clue exist or know what I'm talking about. Federal law, federal Indian law guided my life and the lives of my bio parents, grandparents, and beyond, every American Indian. From reservation, relocation, assimilation, termination, we have all been affected, all caught up in this get rid of the Indian problem. There were two prongs, as I stated, the Indian boarding schools and then adoption into good white families. Many of the same things occurred, as I've already said. And this is my brother and sister that I was also adopted with. And we ended up in this family with a blue-eyed German father, a Scottish-English mother, and two older siblings of the adoptive family. And we stuck out like sore thumbs. There was no denying that we were different. So my whole life, I'm different. This photo was in Bethesda, Maryland. Anybody been to DC? It's right outside. Anyway, where we moved before civil rights, I'm giving away my age again. So we were colored by Maryland law. We couldn't go to drink the white drinking fountains. My father, even though he's white, had to take us up to the balconies to watch movies. We couldn't go to Glen Echo, which was the big pool, because it was segregated. And so not only were we savages, as I learned in this is the Catholic school I went to on Old Georgetown Road, as we learned in the Indian chapters around Thanksgiving, but we are also colored. So this is an experience I never would have had I been still in North Dakota minding my own business. But from the outside observer, people always say, oh, your father was a surgeon and you grew up in Bethesda, which is supposedly a nice place. What could be wrong? People don't understand that this is an experience that an American Indian could have, and the assimilation policies were a breathtaking failure. And not for most. The tagline, as I told you, was "Kill the Indian, save the child." By itself, that should give chills down your back, and that's how we grew up. They were overturned, as I said, with the Indian Child Welfare Act. But anyway, so I'll take you back to this mountain. And of course, what happened? My father ended up in a ditch, luckily on the upside side. And so this huge car was teetering on its undercarriage. And there's no GPS or cell phones once again. So we just waited, and maybe about an hour later, a logging truck came by and pulled us out. I often wonder, what do people think when I was growing up? Because it was a whole nother enchilada, early 60s, including that logging truck guy. Here's this almost 6-foot Plains girl, and here's this compact little German guy, standing by this marquee in the middle of the forest for no apparent reason. You could see the family picture I showed, my older brother and sister. Couldn't tan if their life depended on it, basically, is all I can tell you. And so we were really just out there. We were the minorities in Bethesda at that time. So we were pulled out, but I still wouldn't get in the car. I'm like, we have got to figure this out. And so he finally found a turnaround that was big enough for that stupid car to turn around. So this time I did get back in, and I said, let me just squeeze my eyes shut, hang on to everything I could. And I realized this is how a lot of American Indians go through life. It's like, let's hope for the best, because nobody gets it, nobody understands us, nobody has what we need, and let's just try for the best. So, the big understanding and the whole kill the Indian, save the child thing was that they were sending us to the gold standard person, the white family who's educated and so forth. So to be fair, I probably wouldn't be exactly here without them, because I had a physician father, and my mother trained to be a nurse, but then when she got all the kids, she was the nurse at home. And yet they were totally unprepared for what we needed, especially in the pre-civil rights era. You can't just treat everybody as per usual. It just didn't work. So let me see. You should know that the detrimental federal policy periods were over at least 250 years. And this is one of my main points on all my talks. Those were targeted, persistent, and systemic policies. And so when we say, oh, well, what can we do now? It has to be just as targeted, persistent, and systemic. You can't just have one-offs. You have to be as much into pulling this out, which is the reconciliation. You can't just say, oh, let's offer an article and maybe a talk or something. You have to really work on it as hard as it was worked on to get rid of us. You have to work that hard to get us back. So I'm going to leave you with some of these terms now. Decolonization means to make room or move over and add something, correct what is wrong, because often we're not mentioned at all. And when we are, often it's wrong. Or there's this Pan-American Indian thing. You really have to know the regions and tribal specific information if you really want to do it right. So I go back to my siblings when we were growing up in Bethesda. No one ever asked us, are you okay? Do you feel safe? Is it going well? And no, it wasn't. Nobody, not even my immediate family, not the larger extended family, not the schools, not the congregation, which was essentially the neighborhood. Because again, what could be wrong? You're doing fine over there. And only it wasn't. If you would have asked my siblings, they would have said, no, we don't feel safe. And they weren't. They had a terrible time, and both of them died fairly early. It just did not work for them, and this is why all these things were repealed. Oops. Oh, I must have forgot to put there. Pretend it says indigenization. It's now that you make room and correct things, what are you going to put in there? And again, you need faculty development if they're not Indigenous to know what to put in there, or bring in Indigenous people and or both to know that you're putting in the right things. And as I told you, educators will say curriculum is too tight, that has to go. And I already told you some about that. And then there's reconciliation, which is bringing people into the position they would have been had there not been all the interference I talk about from the 2 generations it took to get from my grandfather to this. And so had they not been crowded out in the first place, where would people be? What would be the understanding? And I'll give you a little tip about Indigenous knowledge. So I moved to New Mexico in '91, and I was here for about 6 years. But right as I came, there was hantavirus. Does anybody remember this? Hantavirus. And, you know, Native people were saying, we know what this is. We know what this is. We know what this is. But the alphabet soup people were here, you know, CDC, NIH, IHS, VA. And they're like, you don't know. We don't know. You don't know. And then finally, after a year or two, they're like, huh, well, what do you know? And they're like, well, it was because there was vast rains and the pinon bushes really bloomed, and then they dropped a lot, and then the mice came, and then this, it's happened before. We know exactly what this is. And you're right. You know, but you have to say you know something over and over and over. And I also tell some of my students that the thing about hair, you know, when I was going to nursing school, people were like, oh, the Indians want their hair back and all that. And then fast forward like 30 years, I was nursing supervisor somewhere in New York. And in order to get the job, because I was kind of doing it on the side per diem, guess what? They took my hair. They made me pull this over and cut some of my hair to the roots and whatnot. Why? Because you can see, did she smoke? Did she use drugs? You know, what nutrition and stuff. When we were saying all along, there's information in that hair and I want it back, and like, oh, you guys, and guess what? Now they're doing it. So I want to tell you a little bit about this poll. You'll be able to see it more better in a minute, which is, this is the reconciliation poll on the University of British Columbia campus. And the reconciliation is to those residential boarding schools that I told you about. It's built in thirds, and the bottom third is post-Salish people living their good life. You know, so there's salmon and ravens and bears, and they're just living their life. Then you can see halfway up here, there's a residential school carved into it, and there's skeletons under it. And there's a ring of students right above it. And they're purposely carved without feet because now they're ungrounded. And then as you go up, you can see it later, there are two boats because there's a canoe for indigenous people and a longboat for colonial inspired people. But they're both supposed to be pulling in the same direction, but recognizing we have different ways of thinking, knowing, being. So don't cross, but just go in the right direction. And then there's an eagle on top for power and reconciliation and so forth. So in the US, we haven't hardly gotten to decolonization, let alone indigenization and reconciliation. So we have quite a ways to go in our health programs. So I'm going to leave you with a last story on this part. Last story about my own reconciliation. When I told you I left at 23 and got in the car and moved to North Dakota. I wanted to see where I was from. I met a brother in that picture that I didn't know I had until then. Later, a sister, when I'm in my 50s, I met a sister who had been adopted away. Didn't even know she existed. So there's 3 children with things going on, and we didn't even know. Taken all this time to figure it out. And then as you heard me trying to churn through it, I'm reclaiming my Dakota language. So these are my forms of reconciliation, meeting my family, going back to the land, finding my language, getting back to things that were all not available to me. So this is what I saw growing up. I don't know, again, you've been to Bethesda. A sea of white faces. That's all I ever saw, but I was used to it. The people I saw would always say, "Who are you? What are you? Where are you from?" As if I'm the one that's out of place. And we stuck out all the more, the older and taller we got, and the more our little parents shrunk. And so here we were, these big plains people. So I moved to North Dakota, as I said, and I met my first real Indian friend. And she took me to a doing at her reservation, the Turtle Mountain Band of the Chippewa, up in North Dakota near the Canadian border. I entered somewhat tentatively as there were hundreds and hundreds of natives in this cavernous building. First of all, that blew my mind. I only knew my brother and sister. I've never, ever seen this. I didn't know what this was. I didn't know what to do. And I thought, okay, here come the questions. Who are you? What are you? What do you want? But nothing. People looked right by me. People had tacit acceptance. Nothing to see here. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what is this? And so I said, this must be what most white people feel like every single day. And it took me 23 years to have this feeling. And they don't even know they feel like that. So those kind of things really kind of blew my mind. And I've had many since, all because of being taken away in the first place. And so there's probably not a lot as nurses that you will run into with indigenous people. This is just my story. There's people that grew up on the reservation. There's people who, you know, never got to go back, et cetera. Everybody has their own story, and there is no Native American. It's the specific tribes or communities. So lastly, my parents had good intentions. They were kind and generous, but was unknown and undone. What was unknown and undone left too big of a gap. It was because of them I took on their interests in science, healthcare, and policy. But my brother and sister, unfortunately, in the turmoil of unconsented forced assimilation, fell off my metaphorical mountain. They died fairly early. And at the time of my 3rd sibling's death, of the 4 of us, my biological brother, the 2 I grew up with, and me, our life expectancy when the last one died was 41, which is almost the same as it is on my reservation anyway. So we really need to have some huge improvements. I've been the only one here now for a long time. but I'm gonna, at the end of this, uplift this a little bit and show you that reconciliation poll in action, because it's really fabulous. Where am I at here? So I will rip through. I can do it in just 5 minutes. So anyway, here's the people that needed to be lifted up. My siblings couldn't, and what you can do, I've said all along. Get to know, if nothing else, the area you practice in, or the area you recruit in, or the area that you work in. Everybody isn't the same. And there are 24 tribes in this state alone. Understand to decolonize education. Figure out what's wrong, figure out what's missing, and then purposely put some things in there. Note that always changes should be made. And learn something new. So this is my last uplifting thing. And I want to tell you, this is the perfect example of reconciliation, which is a Haida carver. These are tribes in British Columbia, carved this. It went on Musqueam land, which is the land that the University of British Columbia is on. There had to be diplomacy and interactions and negotiations just for that to happen. Then the province had to okay, it cost millions of dollars for this thing to go up. The university had to agree. The whole communities had to go in and say, oh, we need to do this. There are 680,000 brass nails in this thing representing the lost children. So it's just this fabulous thing. And when you see it go up, you can't see but it's not machines. They're doing it in the old fashioned way, pulling this up. It's only like 1 minute. Figure it out. Yeah, I like the old #1 poll. It sounds like a cowbell caller, but anyway, these are some resources, that book, and we have a Navajo woman on the cover who's a midwife. I think some of you might know her, Nicole Anthem. She's Navajo. And then in plain sight was this anti-racism thing that I did in British Columbia, anti-Indigenous racism. And then most recently, I was on this consensus study about how to deal with racial ethnic differences, and I forced them to put in tribal health in there. So they did. So my last picture is, it was inevitable for me to become a nurse because the one on the left is the one who raised me, the one on the right is the one who birthed me, and I'm there with the arrow. I'm always in the back because I'm too tall. So I think that's it. So okay. Does anybody have any?
I'll start.
Uh-huh.
So what do you think about Deb Haglund as the interior, area of the interior? And the fact that the president apologized.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's fabulous that a Native woman is in charge of the interior, which is all the Native, including all the Native lands and trust lands, reservations, and so forth, that she can bring. I'm sure it was her idea for this apology. I did watch it. it's a little late and I wish it was a little stronger. And I'm not sure if there's anything after it, which is always my problem. Sometimes the one and done, you know, if people miss the news that day, do they know there was an apology about any of this? So it's a great start, but I think there need, again, persistent, targeted, keep going with the stuff till people get it. It might take people, what, 3 to 5 times of hearing something to go, oh yeah, you know. So. Anybody else? Okay. Uh-oh.
Do you ever come to the East Coast or know anyone in Maine? And
No, I go to the East Coast a lot, but I don't think I've been to Maine. I don't know if I know anybody there. I made it as far as Connecticut. I worked at in New Haven and met the chief of the Mohegans. So that was fabulous. And she was my first DMP student, you know, in our first cohort. And now she's your US treasurer, by the way, signing your money. But that's about as far north and east as I ever got. Mm-hmm.
were you able to have your parents, your tribe, or where you came from? Or
All they knew and all they would tell me was that I was Sioux. So again, this is an old term, right? And it turns out that that's not where I was enrolled. I was enrolled in the 3 affiliate tribes, which isn't, that's their own Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara. But it turns out in that picture, the other part of my native lineage is from the Dakota people up in Saskatchewan. I think it's called, I don't know them that well, the Standing Buffalo First Nations. So that's all they knew. And they never really told me anything, or I didn't learn anything unless I tried to find it. And so it was my birth mother who contacted me at either in or towards the end of high school. Your favorite word, but I could tell that she who raised me was like crestfallen when this letter came, because she laughs at me when I say that. Because I'm sure she thought I'm just going to go racing off to the reservation. I'm 18. I don't know anything. This is all I've known, you know. So, but since that planted the seed that I knew that she wanted to meet me, I waited till I graduated college and then I went. And I had been adopted through Catholic Family Services. Sorry, I have a hiccup. In Fargo, North Dakota. So I knew I could just go to that agency and they could put us together, which they did. Mm-hmm.
um, and you know,
Or inequities.
yeah, I think, yeah. So anytime I bring that up, you know, bring that up. no, And so preservation, we have so many things.
Mm-hmm.
So I take it all the way back. to my mom. And so anytime I bring up topics, and I want to discuss them, people don't want to discuss. And how do you get on those?
Yeah, first of all, again, a lesson from Canada is Truth and Reconciliation Commission from almost 10 years ago. And what they say is you can't have truth before reconciliation. And we now know there was no truth. You know, you didn't learn it. They didn't learn it. They don't know anything about it. They don't know what you're talking about. And nobody ever wants to feel dumb or you're lying or whatever. No, you have to say this is the truth. And in order to get past these inequities, first we have to know the truth. Then we have to decolonize and reconcile. You have to keep saying those words over and over for people to get it. And I know it works because it happened in Canada. In the last 10 years, you can go to anybody on the street probably and ask what's decolonization. because they keep, it's been federally mandated, it's provincially mandated, it's in the health professions, and it was mandated in K through 12 in like 2 or 3 grades. You must speak about this because nobody ever did, and nobody does here. I had all the same K2 through 12 teaching that everybody else did. I never learned it. What do you learn? That turkey, you do your hand at Thanksgiving. And then you talk about Christopher Columbus, who never set foot in America, and that's, you don't learn anything else. So people, A, don't know it, B, don't believe it, C, so you do just have to, yeah, I'm sorry, but this is the truth that we know. And repetition, I guess, is one way to do it.
I started working on what you were talking about, aerodynamics. Why do we not have the needed?
Mhm.
I was working on trying to get more Navajo winners. To start working on that.
Mhm.
Why didn't the nations? And then I was shining too big of a light. So, you just think that.
You mean like from non-natives were saying this, or natives? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because there's been no light all this time.
Yeah, it's like, I kept pushing, I kept.
Mm.
You,
Well, they don't know any better. They just don't know. Oh, trust me, I've had my problems. As she's heard many times my stories, I've been told to go back to the reservation and chew leather. I've been told to cut my hair to look like the rest of the faculty. I've been told, oh, you have it easy. They all think that I made it to where I am because of EEO. I probably got some kind of, no, first of all, I'm too old for that stuff. But second of all, I didn't. I just motored through, and my daughter here, I often use your example, also had a problem in when she was just starting college and supposed to write this paper about what Christopher Columbus coming to the West. And she decided to do, from the indigenous point of view, looking east. Who is this person? Anyway, so she wrote up this whole thing, and it wasn't accepted. It's like you either toe the line from what we're saying, because that's all they know, or you're going to get a terrible grade. So these things are going on and on. I just started, and I get facts, and they can't refute my facts. So you can't there's a thing in the law called willful blindness. It's like you need to learn this. It's there, and you can't deny it. So I don't know. Yeah.
on the reservation, on the Navajo Nation, we learn our history. Part of it. You learn the Navajo. And you leave.
Yeah. And even these august places don't know. So I was at Yale for about 5 years, and they asked me to give some talk about the usual stuff I talk about at this, I wish I could remember what it was called. It's some society of, old doctors or whatever. And we're at the medical school. Anyway, old doctors. And so I told them, like about my usual, the policy periods and federal Indian law and all this stuff, and, Trail of Tears and boarding schools and just all my fun stuff. And at the end, they're like, that never happened. These are old Yale Ivy League doctors. They're like, no, I never heard that. I never heard of that. I'm like, what do you, get a book, I thought you people were supposed to be the smart ones. But anyway, yeah, it's just not why they got the same education we got. It's just not in there. Tribal schools, perhaps, but I certainly didn't get it. Not K through 12, not, well, my biology degree. What are you going to do? And then not in any of the 3 nursing programs: pre-licensure, master's, PhD. In fact, I often tell this story. of my PhD program, there were 6 of us, whittled down to about 4 as it went on. And I'm just sitting there in my own business, and the 2 faculty there go, Margaret, you're exotic. What do you think about this? I'm like, not only am I not exotic, I'm the only indigenous person in here. They didn't know what I was talking about. I'm like, indigenous is from here. You all are exotic to America. They're like, no, these are the professors. And then they came back like 2 weeks later and go, oh, you're right. So if they don't even know the word indigenous, you know, what the, anyway. There's a lot of learning to be done out there is all I can say. Ah, and you're grading me, but anyway,
Thank you.
thank you.